thank everybody, the DEPA members that are watching this video. We've got David Crane, who has been a longtime DEPA lobbyist in Washington, D.C., who has a new company he's working with. It's the Bose Public Affairs Group that David's working with now. And this is going to be like a casual conversation. We're going to talk to David. Those of you that have participated in our webinar series and read our newsletter have seen articles that David's written about the election that happened in November leading up to it. And then post-election, we've had some comments from David as well. And we thought we'd go ahead and kind of get a jump on 2021 and what our lives may look like politically starting next year. And the seriousness of that is starting to hit home with a potential, and what looks to be certain to be a Biden administration with some of the potential cabinet picks, EPA administrator, et cetera. I'll let David talk about those things and however he wants to start this off. But David, probably the way for me to start is to maybe ask you a couple of things leading into 2021 that are going to be, I think, issues our folks are concerned about. And again, we don't know who those cabinet picks are going to be and exactly how that's going to shake out, because Biden's not even official yet. So we've got to wait until that plays itself out. But anything you might have to say about some of the names that have been floated for EPA administrator, interior, et cetera. We also know in the financial sector, there may be some names that have been floated around in different positions there. And also the whole regulatory thing. We've had some great, and if I'm piling too much on you here, let me know, and I can space these questions out. But we've had some great regulatory relief over the last 4 years with the Trump administration, and we DEPA have worked very close with that administration and have been appreciative of those efforts. Where do you see that headed as well, and what might happen? And the other big issue is always taxes. We've heard from Biden earlier that he was going to take our subsidies away from us, and we all know we don't have subsidies, but what he's talking about are our tax breaks. So that's how I'm going to start things off. I've thrown several at you there, so I'll let you just start up, and you know me, I'll interrupt you whenever I want to. So
I think the easy thing to say is that, and the most obvious is, we're in for a lot of change, and that's primarily from an administration standpoint. It may or may not also be from a congressional standpoint, depending on the outcome of the runoff elections in Georgia, and we can touch on that. I think in general, we can maybe start with just the administration and really think in terms of a framework. Because that's how the change is going to come at us, that involves sort of the transition period that we're in now, where we're beginning to look at personnel. And I don't know who I'm misquoting here, but I've heard a million times personnel is policy. So that makes a difference. And so the transition phase, then day one of the administration, the first 100 days of the administration, and then the rest of the year. So those are sort of the 4 phases. The first one of which we're in now, but each one has meaning, and each one's likely to affect the domestic energy industry in different ways. So the transition, what we're seeing is the beginning of naming of key cabinet secretaries, and for us, I think we really need to think in terms of from a public policy perspective, how do we expand the field? Because we're going to have to expand the field. And there's no better representation of that than the financial team that Biden just named. So historically, from a domestic energy production perspective, the financial team was not that important a player, right? Important in trade negotiations, some of the things that Mnuchin took on himself. But in general, the banks are the banks, and we deal with the banks from a purely business perspective. But the financial team that's coming in, starting with Janet Yellen, who's well known to everybody, I'm sure, as the Fed chairman, but also downline in terms of economic advisors inside the White House, and we can, if you put policy first. as well as the what we're going to see in terms of nominations to the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Deposit Insurance Association. But there's going to be a focus, and there's a Wall Street Journal today about how Biden's economy could affect, how Biden's energy policy could affect the economy, and it's a discussion of this effort to pull climate change into economic policy. So, telling the banks, for example, now, and the Fed has done this for the first time, to calculate climate risk as part of the actual financial risk of the institution. And to say to the banks that you have to have lending policies that are guided by climate change and the impact of climate change on the economy and on the companies that you're loaning to, as well as we would anticipate a global perspective on this. What is the impact of climate change based off the loan that you're making to that energy company, to that pipeline company? What adverse impact could that have on other parts of the world? And to force a financial calculation along those lines. So this is part of this growing ESG movement. We saw it as campus divestiture movements early during the Obama administration, but it's really an importation of kind of a European style of dealing with the environment, of using financial institutions and collusion and collaboration between private companies and financial institutions to choke off funding and financing and to raise the cost of capital for energy producers in an effort, frankly speaking, to put them out of business, to drive up the cost of business so high, and by extension, the costs of their products so high that they'll no longer be competitive. And so I think focusing on that economic team first, I view that as an imminent threat. In addition, Neera Tanden, who's been nominated or been announced as a nominee to be director of the Office of Management and Budget, which is the key budget agency for the government and for the administration, is singular in the sense that every single rule and regulation that's proposed by any agency within the government has to go through and be signed off on by OMB. OMB does the scoring and for legislation from administration. So it's that one singular job that sits at the intersection of the administration's relationship with Congress and the administration's control over every agency. And she has been very radical in this idea, in sort of subscribing to the Green New Deal, subscribing to very, very progressive policies as it relates to energy, and has been made very, I think her nomination makes very clear that the administration intends to impose a climate regime on every aspect of federal regulation. So we want this to be the target, but our consumers.
Let me interrupt you just for a second and talk about, follow up a little bit on some of what you just said. That, and I understand that there are those that would be in a new Biden administration that are going to be true believers that we're not necessarily going to be able to get to and talk common sense. But as you and I have had the conversation before, and we have had some charts and graphs going back into last year that we've used in DC with policymakers to show the realities of fossil fuel use over the next 30 years, according to EIA and IEA. So that, and if you look at that and you talk about that, so then what you just said about some policymakers in finance for a new administration that end up, what they're doing is driving up costs so that our prices are so high that they become prohibitive and drive us out of business. In fact, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's just us, because the Saudis and the Russians, those guys are still going to be doing exactly what they're doing today, right? And does that have any legs for us when we're moving into a new administration and talking to Congress about this?
Well, I think Congress is a target, yes. But when you think in terms of the administration, so I'll touch on both. What we've had for the last 4 years is, and this is not meant to be partisan, just a reality, is an administration that was basing policy off of what was best for the first. And
okay, you need to say that again because you just broke up.
Okay, what we've had for the last 4 years, and again, I don't say this from a partisan perspective, but to state the obvious, is an administration regardless of what the policy was, the negotiating position of the administration was what is best for the United States, what is best for America first, right? That make America great again. That was the policy. And so you had this big movement away from internationalism. And I think that the reality of the Biden administration and everyone they're appointing and all the rhetoric is that they're going to move back into this world of internationalism. So to give you an example, we know that the EU in Europe is moving to ban the importation or attempting to ban the importation of U.S. natural gas because of hydraulic fracturing.
Right.
Regardless of the impact that U.S. natural gas has made in terms of bending CO2 emissions at U.S. power plants, conforming with and meeting the Paris Accord standards, as we know, simply because it's fracking. So they're saying we would rather buy our natural gas from Russia, who has, I'm guessing, some of the poorest environmental standards and controls in the world, because it's not derived from a practice of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. So when you move back into this internationalism versus America first, and not at the expense of others, but America first, then all of a sudden your math changes, right? Because the vision of globalist Green New Dealists, of the climate change extremists, is that this is an existential crisis. We're going to force everybody to conform, and we're going to ask the United States to pay for it, or at least the producing, the wealthier countries to pay for it, and of course we'll be first in line for that. So those numbers, this reality that you talk about, which is that both the EIA and the IEA project that basically the total amount of fuel consumption all the way out to 2050 is really not going to change. It's going to be oil, natural gas, coal, and other carbon fuels making up 75% of that energy mix. That's both domestically in the United States and abroad. They don't care because their jumping off point is this Paris Accord viewpoint that we're just going to get rid of fossil fuels by 2050. So those numbers don't really matter anymore. And that's the position, right? So it's dangerous enough when it's Europe and when it's individual politicians in the United States. But now it's the philosophical perspective of the entire administration and the majority in the House of Representatives. So we're going to see some shocking changes that are going to not be science-based, that are not going to be based off mathematic calculations, actuarial risk when it comes to financial institutions and lending, or not, rational cost-benefit analysis in terms of rules themselves. Everything is distorted by these irrational objectives of the Paris Accord. And the administration is going to be hand in hand with the Europeans and other countries in doing that.
Okay, so there's a question that I have, and I'm not sure how this works, but so Obama signed on to the Paris Accord without Senate ratification, so it really wasn't binding on us. And then Trump de-signed us,
right?
And that took a couple of years for that to actually happen. So what happens if on day one, as he says, Biden re-engages the U.S. in that? How long does that take? I mean, and is there some delay there or something? And I've also heard some talk that maybe between now and January 20th, that the Paris Accord would in fact be put before the Senate for a vote.
Well, I mean, certainly McConnell could bring it up as a vote, but because it wasn't presented to Congress as a treaty to be ratified by Congress, and the reason that wasn't done is it would not have been ratified by Congress. Right. Then it's a little like, I'm trying to draw the analogy, the War Powers Act, right? So theoretically, Congress could use the power of the purse to reverse an executive on a declaration of war. But nobody really wants to test that in the courts constitutionally. And so I think that's one of the potential delays is if there's litigation around implementation. But remember, there's a whole lot of things that an administration, the rulemaking process, through the regulatory process, et cetera, and they're going to do everything that they can to conform in any possible way to it. The barriers come to what has to be done legislatively. And that brings us to that January 5th special election, because right now you have a Democratic majority in the House, much narrowed, but a Democratic majority nonetheless. You have a Democratic administration, and if on January 5th, Republicans don't win at least one of those Senate seats in Georgia, then you're going to have a democratically controlled Senate as well. And at that point, I think the types of things that we're talking about here and what the implications of that are, is that you hear a lot of discussion about getting rid of the filibuster rule, which is the requirement that there's a 60 vote threshold
Right.
on passing legislation in the Senate. We no longer have that on nominees, obviously, but it still exists for ordinary legislation. So for the Democrats, what's going to happen in that situation is you're going to have a House that's going to be passing ever more radical legislation. You're going to have a White House who's sitting there with the president who's saying, if you get it to me, I'll sign it. And you're going to have Chuck Schumer, who can't get to 60 votes in the Senate. So those bills keep dying in the Senate. If that happens 3 or 4 times, I guarantee you the pressure will be so enormous on Chuck Schumer to get rid of that filibuster rule that he'll do it, even though he says he doesn't want to. And guys like Joe Manchin will go along, even though they say they won't now, because the alternative, really? Well, sure, because the alternative will be, that first of all, that assumes no Republican would vote for it, but I don't think just an enormous amount of, he would be singled out, right, as the person who's killing it. So then what you do if you're the House is you just start passing bills that maybe don't have Republican support, but things that Joe Manchin really likes. And sooner or later, he's got to answer the question. So I think it's just a matter of time under that scenario before that filibuster rule goes away, because keep in mind, Chuck Schumer's up for re-election in 2022. Right. And while there's no risk of a Republican challenger in New York, there is a congresswoman from the South Bronx who's looking for something to do, who, named Ocasio-Cortez, who could very likely challenge Chuck Schumer for his Senate seat in New York. So if you're Schumer, the easiest thing to do in the short term and the long term from your career perspective is to get rid of the filibuster.
Wow. Okay, that would be shocking. Well, we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but as I kind of opened things up, what about some of the potential cabinet picks and regulatory relief and the use of executive order to ban any drilling on federal lands, and et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. Well, and as you know, there's a lot of tension around potential nominees for the Department of Interior. So let's just kind of set that aside. I know Mary Nichols, who's a well-established bureaucrat and environmental activist in California, is sort of sitting at the top of the list of potential nominees for the EPA. But I think, again, let's sort of follow that construct. So not knowing who some of these people might be, what we know is what their philosophy and their ideology will be. Right. Which is all going to be, and we'll just use it as the umbrella of the Green New Deal and all of its iterations. So that's going to be the reality we're living with. So what does that look like? Well, let's move from the transition, where over the coming weeks we're going to know more and more. And I'll put together a chart for DEPA and forward it to you as these nominees go into place. But you're going to see day one. So let's go transition, which is now they're starting to unveil their nominees, their potential cabinet members. That's important because as soon as we know those names, and really even before, and Jerry, you've had leadership on this from the beginning, is beginning to communicate up to Congress what our concerns are. And again, I think these financial regulators and people in the OMB director are people that maybe in the past we haven't needed to be concerned about, but now we're going to need to go to that banking committee. And we have some really strong members there. You have Kevin Cramer being foremost among them, but many on that committee who are strong supporters of domestic energy. And we're going to have those questions ready to go. And we're going to have those members willing to stand up and say, I'm going to vote against this nominee because of their philosophy on energy.
Right.
And so this transition period is not just about learning who's there. but beginning to target and mobilize, so that as these nominees are actually forwarded up to the Senate, even before they're getting there, sending strong signals of their opposition based off of their philosophy on energy. And I think this is one of those things, and we move on to day one and first 100 days, but this is one of those things where DEPA plays a critical role. Because as we've seen, there's an ever greater divide between these large integrated global energy companies that are primarily regulated out of Europe, right? So they see the end coming. They know that as long as the European Union's there, sooner or later, they're either going to change from fossil fuel production to something else, or they're going to be put out of business over time. Or be forced to relocate into other jurisdictions. But again, with the Paris Accord, that gets harder and harder to do and still function as a first world company. Mm-hmm. So increasingly there's that divide, and DEPA is really the only group in my experience up here that's filling that void, that's going in, that's focused like a laser on these issues that are mission critical to domestic energy. And again, as these nominees come up, the swamp is alive and well. So if you're head of a trade association, if you're, in-house lobbyist for certain kinds of energy companies, you're going to decide, do I really want to go over and stand in the line of fire on the Senate Banking Committee, where I do my everyday business? Do I want to upset the administration? Do I want to upset that potential that confirmed, if you're not successful in taking them down, run the risk of failure and have an EPA director who's already after you? And, they're already after you. This is an existential exercise here. They're out to put you out of business. So you fight them as soon as, I think it's U.S. Grant. I named my middle son, this will upset all the Southerners, Ulysses, after U.S. Grant. But he has got a great quote: the art of war is simple enough. Find your enemy as fast as you can, hit him as hard as you can, and move. And I think in this case, we know who our enemies are, so we need to get at them as fast as we can. We need to hit them as hard as we can and just keep moving, because they're going to come after us. And that'll start on day one, when, as you mentioned, executive orders. So all those great executive orders that President Trump did over a 4-year period of time for domestic energy are all going to be done on day one. And then there'll be a whole series of new executive orders. So again, what can be created by the stroke of the pen can be undone by the stroke of the pen.
Right.
We should expect a whole series of new executive orders, and sprinkled throughout many, if not all of them, will be mandates for environmental justice, mandates to address climate change, directives to cabinet secretaries, to regulators across the board. So from the beginning, one of the 4 or 5 fundamental tenets of a Biden administration is to basically put domestic business, put the fossil fuel industry out of business, place huge subsidies for renewable energy, which brings you to sort of the first 100 days. So all the old EOs go away, all the new EOs, all the new executive orders come into play. And then you're going to start seeing the legislative process, what bills are sent by the administration to Congress, and what bills are Congress passing and sending to the administration for signature. Now, that latter piece will be determined by the outcome of the Senate election. But we can anticipate that across the board, the administration in their budget, in the transportation bill that they're likely to send to Congress to pass, in the economic stimulus package that they send to Congress to pass to restart the economy, that littered throughout all of that will be climate change language in every aspect of it. We should expect it across the board. We've already made clear they want to get rid of the subsidy on domestic energy, which we all know is basically how we deduct our expenses and how we depreciate our assets for the most part, just like every other business. But that's a subsidy for domestic energy. So they've made a priority in any tax bill they send up to get rid of all of those tax provisions that treat domestic energy producers like other industries, just equitable tax provisions, and in its place, put in every kind of subsidy on every kind of renewable resource that you can imagine, and also probably subsidize consumers for purposes of establishing a marketplace for those products.
Right. Wow.
So that's the first 100 days and the rest of the year. So
okay,
but the sun's shining.
Okay, and maybe I'm jumping around a little bit here, but as you know, and maybe all DEPA members don't quite know this yet, currently the OCC, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, has a proposed rulemaking out that DEPA will comment on by the January 4th or something like that.
Sure.
So we're working up comments on that. But basically what it is it's to me, and I've read the thing like 3 times, and it's fair lending, basically, is what it says, is that you won't discriminate against a business or an individual based on the business that they're in if you're lending money.
Yep.
And I still don't, for the life of me, see how anybody, and I know that there's a banking lobbying organization that has come out against this, and for the banks to be against it. I still don't see how in the larger PR political world you can say, well, we're not for fair lending. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. So if you might comment about that, and the fact that we did just see a letter from Maxine Waters, who is chair of the House Financial Services Committee, if that's correct.
That's correct.
And,
yes.
and one of the things in there, I mean, she did have a climate change section in there. There's a section on everything. I mean, if you want to keep yourself up at night, you need to read this letter. But there's the climate change, but there's also one specific about that. And she talks about how, well, this is a giveaway to the oil and gas industry. And so if you maybe want to comment about all of that.
Sure. So maybe just starting with Maxine Waters. So Maxine Waters is the chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, which has jurisdictional oversight over the entire financial services industry, from insurance to securities firms to what you call large integrated financial institutions. So those are the Bank of Americas of the world, Cities, Chase, the 5 or 6 Uber banks that are global in nature and that offer a fully integrated suite of financial services. So everything from wealth counseling to securities to sometimes insurance and other things. She sent a letter to the Biden administration, and it was quite a letter. I think it was 40-something pages long. And there was an entire section on climate change. And it advocated for everything that we've discussed so far on the phone, making it clear that the chairman of the committee, which means the majority of the House of Representatives, this is what we believe, that you should basically use every tool at your disposal as the president, as well as the financial regulators themselves. And by the way, that includes a litmus test on those regulators to make sure if they're going to be nominated that they're all in on this. That this should be the basis for financial regulation going forward. And that implications for the domestic energy industry. And the touch point I give you, thing called Operation Choke Point. If you remember during the Obama administration, what the administration was doing through the OCC and other regulators was putting pressure on banks at the individual institution level. So when the bank examiners would come in, do your quarterly examination or whatever it might be, and that's for the smaller banks. Keep in mind, for the larger banks, for the big institutions, their regulators literally office with them. They're there 24/7 in their offices overseeing their activities for the big integrated banks, for example. So the waterfront of bank regulation, and they would begin to ask questions during these examinations. Do you lend to a gun maker? Do you lend to a gun manufacturer? Do you have loans in your portfolio, or do you lend to gun dealers? Now, I'm not going to take a position on the Second Amendment. It's probably a fairly safe thing to do in this crowd. But the reality is that's a perfectly legal business, in fact, constitutionally protected. And yet the effort of those examiners, when your bank examiner starts to ask you questions that aren't on the examination sheet, you listen, right? And then you go back and you report that to your CEO, you report that to your CFO and your risk managers. And they say, well, tell me how much of our loan portfolio is in that particular sector. Well, it's only 2.5 or 3%. Let's get rid of it because it's not worth raising the eye or drawing the attention of the bank regulators, of my bank examiner. So that was Operation Choke Point, and that went through the court system. But that's what the Biden administration is going to go back to. That was an Obama-Biden policy, is to use use that regulatory system, and Maxine Waters is advocating for it, to use that, the power of the regulator. And remember, these are FDI-insured institutions, at least when we're talking about banks. So they're going to do whatever the federal government tells them to do. But they're talking about going further and using the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Future Trading Commission, to leverage the exchanges in the U.S. to put pressure on the institutions that trade on those exchanges to get out of the oil and gas business and not be in that production and not be investing in that, to not as institutional into it. And it's not just, by the way, the regulators. It's BlackRock, which is the largest private equity firm in the world, that has trillions of dollars under management. That's one of the largest institutional investors in most of these big banks, who's telling those banks, you need to quit lending to fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel projects.
Right.
It's Vanguard, it's State Street. So what we're seeing is this sort of collaboration between these large private equity firms and institutional investors who have younger people who are coming out of college, who've been indoctrinated with climate change, who are now managing these funds, who are using that enormous financial power as investors to leverage these companies to get out of this business. And the CEOs are working in that same space. And again, this is where DEPA has been very good. You mentioned the OCC rulemaking. There were a lot of people involved in that, but DEPA met with the general counsel of the OCC, presented an amazing amount of research to them about what was going on. And that really added momentum to getting and validated, frankly speaking, the rule that's sitting before the OCC. DEPA has been at work at the Securities and Exchange Commission for other reasons, basically to rationalize the way capital is allocated, reserves are estimated, et cetera, for the oil and gas industry. But we're going to have to go back there now, really start talking to those more conservative pro-energy members of the commission and make sure that somebody has our back there so that the administration, again, doesn't use a litmus test and get somebody appointed to the who's going to use that power to these financial markets not to lend. So, we're really kind of up against it in a new way, and we're going to have to cover a lot of fronts.
Okay, and I hope that whatever message we're delivering here isn't all doom and gloom to everybody, but at the same time, I think about infrastructure projects and all, and once upon a time the Obama administration was trying to get a huge infrastructure bill passed, and that included
shovel ready.
Yeah, shovel ready, exactly. But it included pipelines and some grid infrastructure stuff that we would have supported. And I just wondered if those kind of things, and you had kind of mentioned something about it earlier, is when you start weighing everything against a Green New Deal.
Right.
And we see it every day now that pipelines are being opposed no matter what, and it's just one of the tools that the Greens are using to try to prevent oil and gas and fossil fuels. And again, we can arm ourselves with all the reality we want, and I think there are those that are going to listen to us. There, obviously there's some of the conservative folks. I'm believing that there are probably some middle of the road folks, even some energy state Democrats who are going to listen to us as well, and want the facts and figures and say, yeah, I understand. In the next 20 years, 75 to 80% of our energy is going to come from fossil fuels. That's just a reality that we can talk to Governor Newsom and all of his pie in the sky and doing away with internal combustion engines and all that kind of stuff. But what's the reality? What's really going to happen, and how many solar panels can you make, and how many wind turbines can you you produce, and where you're going to get the rare earths, and all of that, all of those
Right.
questions
You're going to get it all from China. That's the
right.
answer.
That's
You're going to make
exactly
it all in
right.
China. You're going to get your rare earths in China. And that's one of the great ironies of this, is that
Yes.
the principal benefit, the same country, by the way, that is unencumbered by Paris Accord emission standards for decades to come, right? So there's no shortage of irony in all this, but I do think that this is the key. I mean, foremost, and again, just as a practical reality, let me put it this way: we need to ensure a pro-domestic energy majority in the United States Senate, and in order to do that, the Republicans need to win one of 2 seats in the state of Georgia. So it is impossible to overstate the importance of that, because right now it's 59, right? So
Right.
if the Democrats win 1, they get to 50. So we're 50-50. Or excuse me, if they win them both, and so they get to a tie. So if they get to a tie, then Kamala Harris casts the deciding vote.
Right.
So we got to win at least one of those to get the Republicans to 50, or else we will have an anti-domestic energy leadership for sure,
Right.
if not a clear majority in the Senate. And again,
the reminder to everyone is that Kamala Harris was the Senate sponsor of the Green New Deal.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So, but I think the good news is that because of the way the presidential debate evolved, domestic energy was literally a decisive issue in the election, and while Biden won, he was held accountable on domestic energy. Now, they were very about that, right? Is I'm not going to ban fracking only on federal land. Well, back Biden administration. But then he said, I'm not going to ban and get domestic energy. I'm not going to put them out of business. I'm just going to get rid of their subsidies.
Right.
Which would mean I'm going to get rid of their ability to deduct their business expenses. I'm going to get rid of their ability to depreciate their assets, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to use the mechanism of government to put them out of business. Right. Not by making it illegal, but by building such an enormous burden from a regulatory perspective, including choking off their ability to go to a bank and get a loan.
Right.
It's a comprehensive strategy. Now, the flip side of that is, because it was foremost, and because we're going to the number one pressure and the dominant theme for all of next year will be the COVID healthcare response and the COVID economic response. And that second piece is going to become ever more important. And in fact, the date where it becomes mission critical is coming in very, very quickly because of the vaccines that are coming online, and because of the sort of continued advances in therapeutics. It's going to be all about getting this economy going again. And that's going to be because the Democrats want a good economy like the Republicans do. We all have that as an objective, very different ways of going about it. But that's part of it. That's the altruistic part. But the cynical part is that the Republicans were projected to get wiped out, not just in House races and Senate races, not just for the presidency, but also in the state house races across the country. Texas, for example. So the reality was something very different. In fact, the Republicans, for all the purpose, swept all of these state house elections. So they're going to have redistricting between 20 and 22. And I think this is really where our opportunity lies, because it is going to be impossible to restart this economy without abundant, reliable, affordable energy for consumers.
To that point, and we know that a Biden administration, they've already talked about in the whole up to the election and the campaign trail. They were talking about, revitalizing the economy and getting things started up again after COVID and all that stuff. But they've also talked about some of the Trump administration's policies about reshoring a lot of manufacturing and all. and specifically a lot of stuff that's going on in China, where we found out that, we can't make a lot of medical supplies here. We've outsourced it all to China. And I think that again, a Biden administration is actually on board with some of that stuff. And my simplistic view of the world, I still go, okay, then isn't the light bulb going to go on over their head? So in order to do that, in order to attract that manufacturer, we have to have reliable, cheap energy.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the greatest ironies of this election, right? Is the most controversial policy. In fact, I think the president-elect and Biden called it xenophobic back when the policies were being implemented, were the 301 tariffs on China.
Right.
And that debate went on in a very odd sort of way for a number of years. But what COVID is fully exposed in a moment how utterly dependent we were on China for things as fundamental as the medicines that we take,
right,
for the medical supplies that we rely upon to the health system in the United States. And then you had a senior when the Trump administration was criticizing the Chinese government for not getting the data to us, not letting us know as early as possible. Now we found out it was going on for months and months and months. What was happening in China. You had a senior Chinese official who came forward and said, well, maybe we just won't ship their drugs with public health crisis. And there in a moment, the whole world, in particular, the preponderant majority of Americans, realized this can't go on. And I would add that our European allies were very, very quiet during Trump's attacks on China and the 301 tariffs, because they were essentially hiding behind the skirt of the United States, because they had their IP stolen. They had been forced into increasing dependency on China over decades, and saw the U.S. as doing their dirty work for them. So in this regard, there actually was fairly large consensus around the world that the administration's policies are right. I think the Biden administration is going to be, you can't possibly rebuild the U.S. industrial base without U.S. natural gas. You can't possibly rebuild an infrastructure and transportation system to meet the demands of that industrial base.
You froze up, David. Oh, you went away, David.
Sorry.
Okay,
It's weird. I still have everybody else. I just lost you.
Yeah.
So I think I'll truncate it. So I think you're absolutely right. It will be impossible to rebuild our industrial base, to put the factories and the manufacturing base in that's necessary to onshore pharmaceutical manufacturing, to onshore advanced technology manufacturing, to onshore microchip production, all of the things that are just critical to the U.S. healthcare system and critical to the U.S. economy, without reliable, affordable U.S. natural gas, without the diesel and the gasoline that's necessary to run the trucks and the trains and the infrastructure that's critical to delivering those products to market. And so I think on that issue, again, that's going to be the tension, right? Now, what you hear from the Green New Deal people is, oh, we're going to create millions of new green jobs for a market that doesn't exist today, right? Or exists on the margins of the economy. And so, what is the cost of those jobs? Well, the cost of free market jobs is nothing, right? I mean, you may have some incentive packages that localities put in place to put a factory in. Once that factory's running, once that product's going out the door, once those jobs are in place, that's a revenue maker for the government.
Right.
And so, again, how are we going to accomplish this without a reliance on fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, certainly in our lifetime?
Exactly. Okay, well, hey, we've been going for about 45, 50 minutes here. So before we close down, I guess maybe I'll just ask you, is there anything else that this is being recorded for everyone's information on December the 8th. And I hope we'll get it out to everybody by the end of this week or first part of next week. And because in these times, things will ripen and go sour pretty quick. So we'll hopefully get this up pretty soon. And maybe get David back on again next month. After we know a little bit more about some potential cabinet names and that kind of thing, and what our strategy is going to be on particular ones. But in closing, is there anything that, David, that we've maybe left out in this conversation that you think we ought to make?
Sure. Well, I want to finish by saying there's opportunity here for us. Our issue and our arguments are teed up. There's no American anywhere that hasn't heard the arguments in the closing days of the political campaign on the importance of domestic energy and energy independence. The priorities for restarting this economy are going to be number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, right? Because the Biden's going to have a midterm election. There's going to be another general election in 4 years. So I think that we're in a great position because, again, our arguments are top of mind, front and center, because of the pressure to restart the economy and everything that means in terms of energy demand. We have enormous opportunity. But we've got to go out and we've got to argue with a singular voice for domestic energy production. It's very different. Right. They're targeting us. And so we've got to go out and we've got to make those arguments. We've got to make those arguments first and foremost to moderate Democrats who are going to be vulnerable in 2022 in their House elections. We're going to have to hold that very small handful of pro-energy Democrats in the Senate accountable. And we're going to have to really work with Republicans to consolidate everybody, not to let them be fooled into believing, hey, your way to the suburbs is the Green New Deal. So keep their feet to the fire too. Going in the next 2 years, we're going to have an opportunity because of that redistricting that's going to occur. That's going to make it really hard for another tranche of Democrats to get reelected in 2022. And because of that small handful of moderates that really are the key to the majority for Nancy Pelosi. So if we work with those moderate Democrats in the House and the Senate, if we keep Republicans' feet to the fire, I think we're in a kind of squeeze play, or at least we have the administration in a squeeze play where we can maybe hold off some of the worst of what they're doing, certainly from a legislative perspective.